I'm Michael Clover. I'm TI's Head of Commercial Developments, and we're here today for our webinar on TI latest survey sponsored by Bolloré Logistics on the future of freight forwarding in a post-COVID world. Before we get started properly, I should just go through a little bit of housekeeping for you. So we'll have a 30-minute session today going through the survey results, where we'll talk through various findings from the survey and show you some of the charts and data we've produced. And then we'll have a 10-minute Q&A session. So please do feel free to answer any questions you have throughout the course of the survey. You can use the Zoom tool for questions for that, and then we'll come to them all at the end. I'd also mention that you'll all be sent a copy of the full survey results in the form of a white paper after the session, but we will also make a recording of this webinar available should you wish to watch it again or send it to any colleagues and share it with anyone you like, really. Now turning to the webinar itself, of course, we're really looking at the moment now to the future of the market after the COVID-19 pandemic and managing any subsequent waves that unfortunately may come at us over the course of the coming months. We've already been through several phases of this crisis with, of course, the disruption and dealing with that back in April and May and March, I suppose. And then coming back to the new normal and moving on to this stage of planning for the future now. And really, we've undertaken this survey of, in fact, over 400 logistics professionals to try and map out, what that future market will look like. So, we've looked at some of the big macroeconomic questions that the pandemic has posed, and also much more operational questions, as well as looking at business planning, looking at the role of technology in the future of the supply chain and sustainability as well. So, really mapping out the future of the market there. All of these qualitative findings sit alongside Transport Intelligence's quantitative data offering as well, where we provide projections and forecasts for how different logistics markets and different vertical sectors are likely to develop and grow over the course of 2020 as a result of the pandemic. And then in a few weeks' time, we'll also be publishing our longer term forecasts as well. So together on the quantitative and qualitative side, TI can help provide you with very detailed view of the future of the market. Now, we're joined today to discuss all of these issues by our panelists. First of those is Nick Bailey, TI's Head of Research, who looks after all of TI's research products in the market reports, the white papers, and the online databases like GSCI. He's been overseeing this survey, like many others. Hello, Nick.
Hi, Michael. Thank you for the introduction. Hello, everybody.
Nick. And we're also joined by Dila Sabici, who's one of TI's research analysts and has been instrumental in putting together this survey and analysing the results. Hello, Dila.
Hello, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So before we get started as well, it's probably good to tell you a bit about our sample. So I've mentioned it has over 400 respondents, but just so you know, we're coming from where we're coming from, rather. Dila, would you like to just take us through some of the demographics of the survey sample?
Yes, of course. So in terms of what companies the respondents are representing, we are looking at over 50% of shippers who are sort of manufacturers and retailers. And then we have quite the even split actually between the remaining 46% between logistics providers who are sort of forwarders and then other. Geographically, the majority operates in Europe, which is then followed by almost a quarter operating from the Asia Pacific region. And then to smaller degrees, we have North America and the Middle East and Africa, and then around the 5% mark. We are looking sort of with respondents from Sub-Saharan Africa, South America, and Russia regions.
So quite a diverse range covering all the major regions of the world there. And as you can see, quite a lot of good split between shippers and NSPs and other professionals engaged in the market, mostly consultancies and so on. Okay, so let's ask ourselves now what they, I suppose, think of the market. So our first question is fairly high level, really looking at how the COVID-19 crisis will impact the supply chain strategy over the medium term, over the next few years. Somewhat unsurprisingly, we can see here that almost all respondents agreed that COVID-19 would have an impact on the development of the market. I think the real question for us to investigate really is, to what extent and what will those changes look like over the coming years, and that's what the wider survey is aiming to get into. So if we move to our first major question here, we're looking at some of the macro level questions first. The first of those is the COVID-19 crisis and how it would affect globalization and the re-emergence of national and local supply chains. Dida, would you like to take us through these results?
Yes, of course. So I think it is firstly very remarkable to see that agree and strongly agree did actually get the amount of and number of agreement there in response. However, I think considering how much of a contentious issue it has become over the last few years, especially with sort of this rising protectionism, which culminated in quite aggressive trade wars that have been sort of affecting the traditional ways for several years now, that is then paired with the more eroding rhetoric that almost diminished the many benefits it has also brought. I think the COVID-19 crisis in that sense has only, and not only with the globalization, it has sort of acted as very much a catalyst for many trends. And this has been sort of no exception to this. In fact, I think in many ways, the critics of globalization almost felt justified in their concerns in a way. However, I think in a May figure where we asked this question as well, and there the agreement sort of was more. So the agreement came down by 6 percentage points now in September, which is only, I think, confirming the uncertainty that is so prevalent in the world, and more specifically in the industry that had already been in quite a contractionary territory coming out of 2019. So I think even though we will definitely see a rewiring of supply chains, I think it is important that this is not really the zero-sum game. And as long as there is demand from consumers for sort of product services and especially affordability, it is quite likely to stick around, and even though the rhetoric might suggest a bit more differently there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's a sensible interpretation, really. I mean, obviously we can see quite a lot of people still disagreeing with that, as well, as you might expect. Perhaps we're thinking more about moving into a new phase of globalization, in part because of some of the trends we saw before the pandemic, and also then driven by countries wanting to localize some production of critical things like food supply and medical supplies and that sort of thing as well. And then seeing more of a regionalization of supply chains around perhaps the core blocks in Europe, North America, and sort of Asia Pacific, and particularly China. So it'll be interesting to see what different LSPs will have to do there. Obviously, they'll have to restructure some of their operations and build new hubs in new locations if manufacturing is going to move. But that's certainly one to watch. Okay, and of course, part of that question is around looking at sourcing and how people are going to run their inventory procurement strategy. And the next question really addresses that: how will your inventory procurement strategy change after the pandemic? Dida, could you take us through these results as well?
Yeah, definitely. I think most notably here, it is important to say that only 12% are really saying they are not planning any changes. So the remaining 88 are really sort of confirming the scope and scale of the disruptions that have been sort of sweeping the global economy. In terms of the sort of most important response here that has gained the most responses, the 31% looking to identify alternate sourcing locations. I think that only goes to speak that many companies felt sort of exposed and realized there's an over-reliance on certain geographic locations, and identified this as a weakness, and might be looking to sort of increase the optionality of their sourcing locations. However, those again will come with risks as well. The site selection process itself will require vast investments in terms of time, resources, and capital. And it'll be sort of a question of what the labor force will be able to do. Is it enough? Is it trained and skilled enough to respond to those operational requirements? What is the sort of city connectivity of those cities? As we are seeing sort of volumes moving sort of from China to India and Vietnam in some cases. But what are the risks involved in those? And especially, I think this has become more of an increasingly discussion also in the C-suites too, that sort of disruptions such as Fukushima, what are the country risks analyses for those countries? And I think with these responses, especially, we do see that the demand to create more resilient supply chains as opposed to cost optimal ones has increased dramatically. So the trade-off between efficiency and resilience, I think, will be revisited. And sort of companies are looking to regain control and build a more resilience. And I think that is becoming quite evident looking at these responses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's certainly that's a theme throughout much of the survey, actually, to look at that drive towards greater resilience, really. Nick, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, I think Dina was very thorough there, to be honest. I think this is a really good question that kind of sets up the survey, and it's something that we've all touched on now. I think the no change option, if we kind of keep that in our minds as we move through the survey, we will see a core of respondents to every question who don't change or have coped well or whatever that might be, and that's an interesting thing to keep an eye on. We've mentioned flexibility a couple of times, and if we think about a reduction in just-in-time systems, that is what could be read as a need for more flexibility, or at least less stringency when it comes to more suppliers in more locations. That can also be seen as a need for more flexibility. And I think as well, one of the things when we see relatively balanced answers like this is goes back to something that Dina says. All of these are options to help solve some of the problems that the COVID-19 crisis has revealed. We'll likely see certain of these options applied where they're appropriate. None of these is going to be a silver bullet and solve everything, but used in the right place at the right time and in the right way, these are all really great solutions to add flexibility, to add resilience, and to make supply chains more robust.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's, again, as you say, a pattern we'll see across a lot of the questions as well. Lots of different companies choosing different strategies, which we'll see how those develop. And, there's lots of change that we've seen take place over the last few months. And one of the big questions we're asking is about how long or how permanent those changes might be for the future of the market. Something we've seen whilst companies were dealing with a lot of the disruption in the market was this question around modal choice, particularly as we saw capacity drop off a cliff for air freight with the passenger market, and obviously on the sea freight side we saw a lot of sailings blanked as well. So we asked if companies are planning to make any of the following modal switches as a result of COVID-19's disruption in the market, and you can see a variety of responses there. Dina, could you take us through that?
Yes, of course. I think looking at this, there are two key takeaways really. I think very notably, no changes made has received the most responses here. So the majority doesn't plan on making any changes, given the sort of very unpredictable nature of the crisis and the developments being so uneven, and sort of their lockdowns and then again not. The change is a very costly and elaborate effort, which many might not be willing to make a more permanent switch to for now. On the other side, we do see sort of, and this has been more of a creeping trend already before the pandemic as well, we do see the tendency away from air freight, and sort of contrary to the globalization question from before, actually, the comparison between May and September figures shows a further consolidation of that trend, actually, only because, this is also so much more structural and operational change as well. And if you look at the sort of most recent press releases by the International Air Transport Association, the global capacity is still nowhere near being caught up with what it was from last year, being 30% down. Belly capacity is still struggling at 70% year on year. So the demand might have stayed stable, but capacity continues to remain quite constrained in that sense. So this undeniable volatility is really still sweeping through the air freight market. Which is also in part, again, as I said, due to the passenger travel not having recovered properly. And it does cause rates to skyrocket again in the upcoming quarter, which is expected. So there's much less reliance on it, and sort of companies are starting to look for solutions in other transport modes, and sort of sea freight does appear to be sort of in a more predictable and less constrained situation than air freight is, actually.
Yeah, certainly. It's been very interesting actually to watch what's been going on over the last couple of weeks, particularly on the Trans-Pacific lane for sea freight, and the rates climbing there as well. And I think recently the Chinese government has been suggesting that it may force shipping lines to sort of unblank sailings. so on over the next few weeks to try and bring capacity up a bit. So interesting to watch that space as time goes on and see if those shifts that we've seen over the last few months really stay in place. I think obviously whenever you're having a question around capacity crunches, you have to think about how companies can manage those capacity crunches if their previous volumes or previous capacity they've used maybe less accessible or have been disrupted. And so we've also asked a question around how has your air and sea freight purchasing changed as a result of COVID-19, really looking at the use of contracted freight versus the spot market. Nick, could you take us through these?
Certainly can, Michael. So I think the first thing to do here is to look at the grouping of questions where we have where we have seen an increase in the spot market, and we can see there that generally speaking, it's close to 2/3 have used the spot market for some reason, for either finding better rates or finding capacity, or to help them out on certain markets or certain specific lanes for that. So one of the takeaways has been some modal shifts, but then also a core chunk of people who haven't changed the modes that they're using, we saw in the previous question, but then maybe the way that they're accessing transportation capacity for whatever reason is changing changing more so for more of our survey respondents. And then it also leads us to some wider questions that or some wider trends that we've seen over the last few years in the market. We now have a brand new generation of startups in the logistics market across air, sea and road, who are deliberately trying to make the spot market more accessible. So that is probably coming at a good time, but also we might be able to think of this period as a test of some of those solutions. We've also seen a response from the incumbent forwarders to make their services more accessible, to make their quotes more transparent, to make their quotes quicker, and to remove a lot of the inefficiency we saw on that side of the market as well. So again, this period has really been a test of some of those systems, and I think the fact that we've seen 2/3 of shippers or 2/3 of respondents move to the spot market shows that there's been some success there. I think that the real test here, and it links back to the previous question as well, is the what's next of it. Over the next 5 months of this year or 4 months of this year, we're going to go through a bit of a restocking cycle. That's usual and normal after a big supply crisis that we've had, or certainly at a point in time when demand in consumer markets comes back online. And we're also running into the peak season. So I think a really important question is if we've seen modal switches, as in the previous question, and we've seen an increased use of the spot market because of the crisis up to the point in time that we're in now this year. What do we see over the next few months? And I would wager that we'll continue to see an increased use of the spot market whilst we've still got a bumpiness and an unpredictability in air capacity and sea capacity coming back online.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. And I think that's a question that naturally follows from that is how are people going to continue to access that kind of capacity if it's going to be staying in place? People are going to use more the spot market over the coming months. And as you mentioned, we've seen quite a lot of new startups over the last few years, and certainly a trend towards more digital logistics services and digitalization, and more marketplaces and digital forwarders within the freight forwarding market. So looking really at how companies want to access that kind of service on the spot market, we asked, will your freight procurement method change as a result of COVID-19? And I think we can see here from the results, firstly, 38% said they won't change, or they'll stick with personal relationships and established contacts at logistics partners. That's another 24%. So a lot of the companies are still sticking to their guns in terms of how they go about buying freight services. But it is also very important to recognize the number of people that are now saying that they will make use of more digital logistics services. 13% saying they'll use more freight marketplaces, similar numbers on digital forwarders as well. So we saw before COVID-19 increasing interest in this, and obviously the response of the incumbents, as you mentioned, Nick, to actually provide their services in a much more digital and accessible way as well. And that seems to be something that has been continued and perhaps accelerated slightly by the COVID-19 pandemic, as people have been forced to use those kind of services to get some instant access to those kind of capacities in the market. Obviously in many ways, companies have been using this as a way of responding to a crisis and managing a crisis. And I think another thing that we have to consider is many businesses over the last few months, over the summer, have been considering their sort of plans for dealing with future crises as well, and looking at things like business continuity planning in order to, and supply and flow planning in order to make sure that they don't have to sort of deal with crises in the way they have done over the last few months, perhaps. So actually the next question we have here is, will your business continuity planning change as a result of COVID-19 disruption? Nick, could you give us your views on this?
I can do. I don't think it's at all a hyperbole to say the COVID-19 crisis has probably been the most disruptive event for businesses operating on a day-to-day basis for probably a generation. Maybe you could point to the financial crisis in 2008 in some regards, but certainly when it comes to logistics and supply chains operating, I don't think there's been as significant rapid a shift in the ability of shippers and logistics companies to just do business for a very long time. So when we look at this question, we see 56% between the two top responses there will review and improve planning or add new solutions where they're necessary. I think it's entirely normal that we would see over half of our respondents say that in response to this crisis, they will improve, they will learn, they will try to get better, they will try to make sure that as much information as they can gather from what's gone on in this crisis is possible, and that they use that in the future is normal and is sensible. One thing which I mentioned towards the start of the survey, one of the questions that we saw is something about this core of companies or core of respondents who don't see the need to change, who feel as though they've performed well, or the impacts of the crisis maybe haven't affected them in as profound a way as they have other businesses. And we can see that here with the third level of response there, where 16%, so nearly a fifth, so not an insignificant proportion of our respondents have said they actually coped relatively well. But I think it is important to remember that across that set of responses, we do still have a recognition that this has been a very challenging period, that we will see changes and updates and improvements to business continuity planning. And I think that's to be normal and expected when we've seen such a profound impact on operations, but also employee welfare, company finances, and beyond all of those normal measures.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. I think it's, as you say, not to be, it wasn't unexpected that would be the result of that question. I think, you've got that sort of high level business planning there, but we've also got, a similar question really sort of addressing how companies plan to manage their supply and flow planning model, and how do they, do they plan to make it more flexible in the future? We can also see a very high number of people agreeing with that statement there. What do you think that tells us, Nick?
I think it tells us quite a lot of things. I think it's best to look at this question maybe not so much in a dry how will you plan your supply and flow planning models, but really take it in terms of an attitude towards risk. We'll see repeated throughout the survey that flexibility is a real key which has come from this crisis for many businesses across many sectors, but certainly amongst our respondents as well. And if you think about flexibility when it comes to a supply chain, you can quantify that, or at least look at that through other means by looking at something like your capacity to respond to events or to circumstances, or to see certain events or certain circumstances maybe happening, and can you adjust in real time or as close to real time as possible to those events to mitigate their impact. That's not a particularly new concept in supply chain management or supply chain operations, but it doesn't mean that it's easy to do. But one thing that we have seen over the last few decades alongside that rise in risk management sentiment is supply chains as or the kind of the terminology of supply chain linger, even though supply chains really are supply networks these days. There are multiple nodes. They don't move in a linear kind of progression from one place to the next, certainly in terms of the way that they can operate. And I see the 64% that either agree or strongly agree to this as trying to think about their supply chains in the future and their flow planning and their supply modeling as in a way which allows them to exploit the networked nature of supply chains much more so. So that involves having multiple suppliers, as we've seen in other questions. It involves having maybe a different number of logistics partners, as we see coming up. And I think it's a response to trying to kind of get around some of the risks which are involved with not having flexibility. So when one element of your supply chain goes wrong, it tends to be that several elements go wrong. Or if one key supply point goes down, one key supply partner goes down, the whole chain can stop. So I think I see this question as a desire to gain more flexibility, whether it's on the supply side, whether it's on the flow management side, to take advantage and really exploit the network nature of supply chains in the future.
Thank you, Nick. Yes, and I think that kind of flexibility, of course, is always going to be, or one thing that's necessary for it is going to be better visibility, better technology to enable companies to be more agile in response to what they see going on in the supply chain, which actually brings us to our next question. To what extent has COVID-19 disruption increased your demand for real-time visibility? And that has, of course, been a bit of a hot topic throughout the crisis. Visibility has really been brought to the fore by COVID-19. Theodore, could you expand on that?
Yes, of course. I think considering the number of respondents who said that the crisis impacted their medium-term supply chain strategy, which was essentially virtually really everyone, and we're now looking at 76% saying their real-time visibility demand has increased. And then, as Nick pointed out in the previous slide, the need for flexibility is really sort of pointing towards this very urgent and almost very essential and fundamental need for visibility, because it is quite a difficult thing to sort of introduce flexibility into supply chains / networks in that sense without having the visibility, without knowing where those pain points are, where the disruptions are happening, how they can be sort of, where the pressures can be alleviated. And with the sort of unpredictable nature of this crisis, again, regarding supply and demand, it seems to have caused quite serious issues for companies, making this a very highly sought after tool, if not indispensable. However, again, as Nick pointed out, this is not a new thing. The reason this hasn't been integrated more widely, more comprehensively so far is that it also comes with highly challenging sort of circumstances with it, and it's very difficult to implement these changes and technologies actually into existing systems or to overhaul the ones that are in place, etc. However, we are seeing sort of examples of companies trying to introduce some more visibility on these issues, such as sort of DHL Forwarding is collaborating with Air France KLM to improve the visibility on their pharmaceutical logistics, for example. And then DHL has also an in-house customer portal where they are trying to provide their customers with more full visibility and control over their shipments in air and ocean. So I think certainly this has gained more traction and attention over the last few months, if not years. And it definitely has become a feature companies are prioritizing at the moment.
Yeah, thank you, Taylor. Well, I think, that raises important questions around how companies are going to, manage to introduce that visibility as it's become so much more important for lots of shippers, over the last few months and years. And our next question actually addresses that point. How do you plan to integrate further technology solutions into your supply chain? And as Taylor mentioned, there's lots of challenges around that. It's a very difficult time to perhaps be embarking on that. But Nick, could you provide some insights on that one?
Certainly I can. So when it comes to the types of systems that our respondents are looking for, I think we can see a mix. Again, that was one of the points which we mentioned at the start. We have quite a few questions where there's a mix of solutions that are required, and that's because, again, not one of these solutions really is a silver bullet for all companies. So we have a balance between in-house development of third-party systems off the shelf or customized third-party systems. And we also have a relatively balance there with no immediate plan, suggesting that some of our respondents think that their IT systems are not necessarily, or their technology solutions are not necessarily the problem here. I think that can lead us to one conclusion, and that is that it won't just be the implementation of these systems that's important. It will be their ability to work together and to get them to work together, so you can stitch together an IT solution or a technology solution which really solves the problem and adds value to your business. And I think the second key takeaway from this question is the largest response group, 26%, we expect our logistics partners to bring their own solutions. I think that's understandable. The shippers look to logistics providers to bring IT solutions, especially when it comes to the management of logistics, which is what outsource partners are there to do. But I also think that it points out an important position on the supply chain, or an important position in the supply network that logistics partners occupy, and that is that they are one of the very few supply chain players who touches almost every point of the supply chain. They touch suppliers, they potentially touch into tiers of suppliers, they touch customers, they touch potentially the end users, if you think about, for example, in e-commerce last mile delivery. So the logistics provider occupies a really important strategic position on a supply chain, and the ability of the logistics partner to bring IT solutions and technology solutions which really exploit that and deliver value to their to the shippers and to the manufacturer and retail partners is something which I think comes across quite clearly in this set of results.
Yes, thank you, Nick. Yeah, it's a very interesting point, really, about bringing logistics partners, bringing different technologies, and obviously shippers wanting to ensure that they've got great interoperability between systems brought by various different parties into their overall supply chain as well. I think it raises questions as well about the future of supply chain. We're looking at logistics companies and who's going to be providing these different tools and different software tools as well. And the next question really looks at outsourcing within the industry as well. So if we're thinking about LSPs providing more of the tools, we may see shippers with lots of different LSPs in their sort of carrier pool, a supplier pool, working with lots of different LSP technologies brought by different LSPs as well. So this question on outsourcing really looks at basically just asking which of the following describe your logistics outsourcing strategy. We see a sort of mix of results here. In the top there, you can see that you've got about only 10% of people looking to outsource their supply chain management in the future, but a great deal more looking to outsource their physical operations. As you might expect, people want perhaps to retain a bit more control of their full supply chain management, see it as a core competence after all the disruption of COVID-19, but a bit more willing to outsource more of their sort of physical operations, which may be a bit of a growth factor for logistics companies in the future if outsourcing is going to increase. But we also see there as well, and a bit of a split between companies wanting to increase and decrease their pool of logistics partners. Nick, could you shed some light on that for us?
I can do, certainly. I think you're right to point that out. Is quite an interesting and a relatively even split as well between the responses that we get. I think it's not dissimilar to the supply and flow planning question, where it's useful and helpful to think about this in terms of risk. One of the things which we saw echoed in the survey elsewhere, but certainly in the market for air and sea capacity, was that it was very difficult to find capacity, wasn't it? It's very difficult to find a plane that was flying or a ship that was sailing. And if you had stuff to move, you didn't know if it was going to be stuck at a port because your road freight provider wasn't there to help you out. So I think an increase in the number of partners, especially the increase in the number of forwarders, an increase in the number of suppliers into a forwarder, is a reaction to make sure that there is a greater pool of supply out there for you. And I think that's a natural reaction to the type of capacity crunch that we've seen over the last few weeks and months. And then counter to that, but also I think a way in which you can reduce some of the risk around this is to decrease the number of logistics partners that you work with. But I think implicit in that is the strengthening of the relationship with those partners. So potentially a move away from having 300 partners of all various different sizes, a move into having stronger relationship with fewer suppliers who you understand, you have confidence in, the relationship is strong enough to know that you can get capacity through them even though you have less of them. So it's really a case of where do you place the risk in this relationship? Do you trust on a diversification of a huge number of partners in the market and do it yourself? Or do you work with a smaller number of core logistics partners and work under the assumption that the strength of the relationship and then their subsequent reach into the market for capacity will take care of that for you.
Yeah, so it's all about risk and resilience again, which I suppose is quite a common theme across our whole survey. One other aspect of supply chain resilience, which we're looking at as we look to the future of the freight forwarding market, really, is also the role of sustainability and making sure that our supply chains are fit for the future as well, through other crises, not just COVID-19. So we asked respondents whether or not sustainable development be one of the major criteria for their selection of transport and logistics solutions in the future. Dina, could you give us some insights on that?
Yes, certainly. I think it is quite sort of remarkable looking at these figures, because we're looking at 67% of respondents agreeing to some level that they will be making this a major criteria for their solutions in the future. And I think that's sort of one of the maybe a slight silver lining that might be coming out of this, because the far-reaching disruptions of COVID, there might be this rare tiny window of opportunity for them where they are sort of these supply chains breaking down almost. Does also imply there will be a rebuilding in the aftermath. So as they are restructuring their supply chains, they get to incorporate these increasingly more important also consumer demands regarding sustainability. However, I do think it is important to note that these businesses have been struggling quite a bit, and sort of the primary focus, my guess is that it will be lying on sort of effectiveness and efficiency. And if it does sort of come with sort of nice add-ons such as an eco-friendly solution, that might provide the impetus to make these more permanent services in their portfolios. And I think one way in which this might be realized is this sort of trend towards maybe intermodal switches, where we can see maybe where they can maybe reframe it in a way, if they see an overlap between operational efficiency and implementing sustainable solutions, where they can see, and we're seeing, apologies, sort of these services increasing in frequency, where they are looking to combine sort of rail and sea freight with air freight, where they're relying less on air and more on the other modes of transport. So I think it'll be very much a desired sort of result, but effectively, I think it will come down that the short-term demands might be likely to take over. However, it is obviously great to see that this will become a priority for them.
Yeah. So, but we're thinking that these short-term pressures, this has been exerted by coronavirus, and the need to keep supply chains moving and businesses going, may inhibit some of the pace of change towards sustainability. Then, so we've looked at really a lot of these trends, and looking at COVID-19 as an accelerator of those when we're thinking about digitalization, we're thinking about some of the modal shifts you mentioned, but perhaps sustainability is something that may not be accelerated too much by coronavirus due to other concerns. Although over the long term, we still expect it to become very important, and it's good to see so many logistics professionals, as you say, still agreeing with that, suggest that it will happen over the next few years. Yeah. Well, thank you everybody for joining us as we go through these survey results. I hope that's mapped out the future of the freight forwarding market a bit more clearly for you, and you can try and quantify and understand a few of the trends that we're seeing at the moment and how they might shape 2021 and 2022. So we're now going to move on to our Q&A session. So we'll be happy to take any questions you have from the audience, so please do submit these via the Q&A app if you like. So we'll take the first question, I think, which perhaps we can address to Nick. So that's saying, you say that there's been an acceleration in the trend towards digitalization as a result of COVID-19, and that marketplaces have received more business on the spot market. How do you think, how likely do you think it is they will retain that business, and how do you think they will be trying to do that? Nick, do you think you could provide some insights on that?
I think it's a very interesting question. I think I think a lot of the VC money that's gone into some of those platforms has been predicated on exactly those things. How do we gain the traction? How do we keep it once we have it? And I think a lot of those systems have been designed specifically to point out how much they can offer in terms of customer service and how much they can offer in terms of price transparency. I would, as Michael says, I would suggest that the COVID-19 crisis has been an accelerator of that trend. I think we will see, well, we have seen, certainly our survey responses show that we've seen an uptick in the traction they've gained in the market because they do offer a relatively easy way to gain access to the spot market because they do offer that price transparency. I don't expect all of the gains that they've made to be kept. I think it's reasonable to expect that as we move back into a more predictable time, I'm not going to say at all as we go back to normal, I don't think that's the case, but I think as we move into a more predictable time in terms of capacity in the market, I think as air freight comes back online in some way, I don't think that will be necessarily a quick return to passenger travel, but I think there'll be ways in which the airlines provide more air capacity. I think as the shipping lines unblank some of the sailings or bring them back into rotation, I think as road freight providers kind of get back to a relatively more standard way of operating in terms of moving the volumes around, I think that we will see some of the gains that the platforms have made in terms of volumes per day process stay. I think they will have proven their case. I also think that we'll see an amount of the gains kind of move back through into more understood and kind of standard ways of operating within the shippers culture. I would also say one of the responses which we didn't necessarily pick out to a question was an increased use of tenders in the market. So there are some digital platforms which deal specifically with tenders, but I think that will be a response as well. So I think they'll keep some of it, not all of it, but I think it's been a good thing for these platforms in the test case, improving the concept and gaining traction and exposure to the market.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. The next question we've had is on visibility, actually. So Dina mentioned some innovations by a certain red and yellow forwarder to provide visibility. Do you think it's really feasible to provide visibility through technology and tracking individual items with reference to smart containers as a trend? Nick or Dina, would anyone like to answer that one?
Sure, I can start and then Nick can maybe jump in when if he has to sort of add something. I think in terms of visibility, as we had mentioned before, it is becoming sort of quite this important feature to have and tool to implement. However, the interoperability, as Nick pointed out later on, will play such a crucial role and will pose such great challenges for them that it is, it'll be a great challenge to overcome for them. I'd say looking at the advances in technology, it is in the short-term future probably not as expected to provide full real-time visibility, or it'll be sort of an advancing and progressing technology. In many ways, I think it will be sort of achievable and tangible sort of a lot sooner than some might expect in that sense.
We have certainly seen lots of innovations coming through and lots of announcements coming through as well. I mean, on the smart containers side, and actually also in UODs as well, we're seeing innovations there for sensors, and we're starting to see, new technology coming through with the sort of, able to pulse out responses at high frequency using, in the case of air freight, Bluetooth, which is actually permissible by the aviation regulators as well. So we're starting to see those kind of technologies coming through, but I'm not quite sure I share your full, enthusiasm for it being ready quite so soon. I think some of those are fairly nascent, and we might have to wait a little longer before those kind of technologies become commonplace, to track individual packages and items and shipments, in transit. But yeah, we certainly are seeing improvements there. Okay, well, we've used up our full 4 to 5 minutes of allowed time today. So all that's really left for us to do is to say thank you to all of our participants for attending. And also thank you very much to our panelists, Nick and Dila, for offering their views and insights on the survey. If you would like to get access to the full survey results, then we will be emailing those out to each of you after the webinar, so you should have access to that very, very soon. And if you would like to get more insights on the future of the market after COVID-19, then please do get in touch with Transport Intelligence. We've got a lot more analysis of all of these trends by sector and by market, and including also the longer term forecasts for how the market will grow over the next few years and over 2020 as well. So please do get in touch with us if you have any questions about that. All right, thank you everyone, and goodbye.